they're wreckers and they're muppets.
Brendan Burns.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker.
Sir, last night you made a series of rulings, and I was, quite rightly, sir, a victim of one of them, sir, and I invite you, given the last set of comments by that member, to be consistent. You were right last night, you should be right today, sir, and I invite you to be consistent in your rulings in respect of that last salvo from that member.
Yeah, well, I think the member used some invective that certainly wasn't necessary, and well, I think probably the appropriate thing for me to do would be ask the member to withdraw and apologise that. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw and apologise.
Thank you. Brendan Burns.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little bemused by the speech by my predecessor there from the struggling poor electorate of Taranaki King Country, and his description of the union movement, who obviously haven't done anything to help the poor people of my electorate in Christchurch Central. I just remind them, firstly, there was generous donations made by various unions to the Christchurch Quake Appeal, and secondly, who were there first, he asked. Well, I can tell you who were there first. People like the police, people like the firefighters, people like the nurses, people like the emergency service, most of them members of unions, most of them proud members of unions, some of whom were outside the Parliament yesterday saying they didn't want to see a budget which took the axe to the benefits that they've enjoyed from good sound policies like KiwiSaver and other policies that the last Labor government introduced. Can I start further though, sir, putting on record how pleased I am to see that this budget does provide for Canterbury, and I would say I am probably the member whose electorate will benefit the most from that provision. $5.5 billion put into the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Fund, the SURF, and I'm also particularly pleased to see that the government has picked up the idea of an earthquake bond. I've been doing some work on that myself with the group that I'm the chair of, Iconic, which brings together some building owners, some heritage advocates. Jim Anderton has done some work on that. We've been doing some work on it, and I would hope that as that earthquake bond comes through from the announcement yesterday, we do see that there's some potential for it to at least in part support things like heritage retention in Christchurch. That's important to the rebuild of our city along with other elements, and I'd also hope that some of the money might be directed at some further support for skills training, which is, of course, is essential for our rebuild as well. So there we are, on the record in support of that, and there are now no reasons, no excuses from here on in terms of how that rebuild proceeds. The government has the power through the Sarah Bill, it has the money as provided by this budget, and it's got the department in place, and we are looking for an acceleration of the recovery from here on. No more of some of the delays we've seen with things like heating, where we've had acknowledgement of 4,000 heaters now having been installed when there are 25,000 people who've asked for new heaters. So let's hit the fast forward button now with this budget now funding the recovery of Christchurch. There is, however, for me, a deep and fundamental concern about how the quake is being portrayed in the budget. And yes, it should be the centrepiece of this budget because it is the nation's biggest ever natural disaster. And this government and any government would have to have responded to that situation. But that gives no reason whatsoever, in my view, to provide for the sale of assets, be they state assets or be they Christchurch city assets. And I remind the members opposite that the basis of this budget is that the quake only accounts for 10% of the accumulated deficit. $17 billion nearly. $17 billion, 10% provided for by the quake. So let's not see the quake used as some sort of carte blanche for asset sales. And I wanted to talk first about the assets of my city of Christchurch, where $2.2 billion is held by ratepayers. They are essential to the financial integrity of the city. They keep rates down by about 15%. They've contributed to many important other projects, such as the build of the Christchurch Art Gallery, which became the base for the civil defence and more latterly the Sarah operation. That was the building that stood up, funded in large part by the assets such as Orion. Nearly $1 billion in returns from Orion to the Christchurch City Council and its ratepayers in 20 years. Nearly $1 billion from one of the assets alone. And I challenge the next Speaker from the government, which might be Amy Adams, to stand up and add to my voice saying we will not tolerate any sale of Christchurch City Council or Selwyn or Waimakariri assets as part of the funding of this recovery. And why are we concerned about that? We are concerned because, one, the Sarah Bill provides the capacity for that to happen, and secondly, this budget provides for the sell-down of half of some of the major assets currently held by the Crown. And we look at Mighty River and Meridian and Genesis and Solid Energy and Air New Zealand as being the principal assets that we hold, and we say it's absolutely essential those stay in public ownership because of the dividend stream that they provide. And I want to ask the next member to comment on the issues created by B8 amongst the budget papers. B8, which on page 3 in the executive summary says proceeds from the asset sales, asset sales.
Order. Just a short while ago I was asked to rule on relevance, and this is the Taxation Budget Measures Bill. Who said that? Leave. I'm on my feet. You're out. So I've just asked the member to contain his comments to the matters that are in the bill. I've ruled on it.
Speaking of the point of order, sir.
Oh no, if you're a separate point of order.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Clayton Costa.
Sir, I was the person who, at one point during Mr Ardern's speech, raised an issue with you. And you were generous and correct in your ruling. You stated that things had stretched pretty wide of the mark, and that others had stretched possibly further or as the same level as Mr Ardern. I'd argue, sir, that if, again, in terms of being consistent, that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as it were, sir. And I would invite you to perhaps just have a wee think about the instruction you've given to the colleague.
I think that the matter has made a fair point, but I actually was responding because I had been asked to rule earlier, and maybe I never made the point as firmly as I should have. So I'll just restate what I said then. It's my preference, certainly, that members would. We have strayed wide, but I just think the member, and I just alert him to the fact that that is my desire, that he approach in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I pledge I will not be referring to farmy armies or unions or any other matters from here on. I'm talking about the budget, and I'm talking about how it provides for, in part 1 of the bill, the taxes that will be paid this year, and in part 2 it provides for cuts to working for families and KiwiSaver. And I'm making the point, sir, that part of the whole integrity of the budget is actually including asset sales, part asset sales, and I was wanting to make the point that how can we have that included as part of the budget and its papers and its assessment of forecasts when, in fact, the government has said it won't take those issues to the electorate until November the 26th, and they won't come into play until next year. But here we have in the budget papers, a provisioning for a stream of income from asset sales of the order of $5 to $7 billion. $5 to $7 billion. And I wanted to come to the point around KiwiSaver and the changes made to it in part 2 of the bill. And this to me just continues what has been an appalling record by the national government in office, which dates back to the time of our colleague Sir Roger Douglas, who brought in 1974 a contributory superannuation scheme, a predecessor, if you like, of KiwiSaver, which, if it had been left in place, would have seen us a very wealthy nation today. Would have seen us. Unfortunately, the then national leader, Rob Muldoon, campaigned on disemboweling that scheme, and we've paid a price for that ever since. That's not the only legacy of national superannuation, most recently manifested by yesterday's announcements on KiwiSaver, because in the 1990s there was a cut to the base rate for married couples from 65% of the average wage to 60%, a swingeing cut for those people, and around 70% of people are reliant on national super as their base income. So we had that change perpetrated on New Zealanders in the 1990s under the Shipley administration. Now we have KiwiSaver in about its third permutation, because National came into office saying it was going to cut back to 2% employer contributions, 2% employer contributions, and now we're seeing under this measure a return back to a 3% payment from employers. And what are employers saying? The signals are that's simply going to come out of the wage increases of the employees. That's certainly not contributing, in my view, to the focus on savings which this budget is supposed to have at its heart. If you're going to encourage people to save, as the Treasury and IRD's own regulatory impact statement says explicitly, that you need stability, you need predictability for people to save. They will not put money into schemes if they think governments are going to play around with them. And here we have, yet again, a national government which should hang its head in shame at its past history on superannuation, on encouraging New Zealanders to save. And yet here we again see them playing tricks with superannuation, with a scheme which was actually being picked up by thousands and thousands of New Zealanders every week. 1.7 million New Zealanders have come on board, and instead of enhancing the scheme, instead of adding to it, instead of saying we need to build this into a scheme which all New Zealanders can rely on into their future retirement, instead we're seeing the axe taken to it, we're seeing cuts being made to it, we're seeing the value of it being undermined, and New Zealanders will take those signals. New Zealanders will take those signals and say, well, if the government's not staying aboard, what is the point? Why are we going to contribute to KiwiSaver? And already we're seeing comments around that in the public domain. A final comment I'd like to make is about, supposedly this budget is around growth, and yet we have seen 2 references to exports in the text of the Minister of Finance's speech to the House yesterday in respect of exports. 19 references to debt, 19 to 2. That's the focus of this budget. It's about debt, it's about cutting, it is not about growing. It is a very poor, shabby, shameful budget.
So, I call Amy Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And